It's 1963, and actor Maximilian Schell has just taken the podium to announce the Best Actress Academy Award.
And the winner is Anne Bancroft in Miracle Worker.
Okay, here's where you'd normally expect the camera to cut to the audience and you'd see a woman hugging her friends and family before rushing up the aisle to graciously accept her award. Only this time...
Accepting for Anne Bancroft, Miss Joan Crawford.
Here comes Joan Crawford from the wings to give a speech instead. Anne Bancroft wasn't there, but Bette Davis, Crawford's co-star and Bancroft's fellow nominee, was. And she was pissed. You've likely heard parts of this story before, either as an old film buff or maybe because of Ryan Murphy's recent series Feud. The relationship between these two women looms so large in pop culture that when we talk about Anne Bancroft's Oscar, it's typically just a pretext to talk about Bette and Joan. Anne's story and work are almost always erased or dismissed as an unfair robbery. Instead, her reputation has more recently become that woman who played Mrs. Robinson.
It is so nice to finally get to meet Mrs. Robinson.
Where is she?
And while, yes, obviously her performance in The Graduate is amazing, I don't think that alone does justice to an artist who is, dare I say, highly underrated. So for my Best Actress series, 1963 will come in two parts. In this video, I'm going to give Anne's journey the attention it has lacked. Who was she before The Miracle Worker? Why was her performance so special? What trends in filmmaking did she represent? And then my next video, part 2, will pull back and analyze Bette Davis and Joan Crawford's relationship. What led to this infamous night in history? What was the actual scope of their alleged feud? And why did Bette lose? We'll definitely talk about them in this episode. It's unavoidable, so get ready. But if there isn't enough of them in this one for you, don't worry. You've got a lot coming. Okay, let's get started. You can break Anne Bancroft's filmography into two parts: before The Miracle Worker and after The Miracle Worker. After a screen test caught the attention of Daryl Zanuck at 20th Century Fox, she signed a contract and shortly thereafter made her film debut in 1952's Don't Bother to Knock. It was a strong start and well-reviewed, but wildly different supporting roles followed, and it became clear that the studio wasn't really interested in developing her. She never really worked with directors who would challenge her, and never starred in anything the industry would deem prestigious. As her biographer, Douglas K. Daniel, put it, she was not widely known, and even though she had worked steadily and collected good notices, she seemed just another pretty girl with high movie hopes, according to Luella Parsons, not too distinguishable from hundreds of similar young actresses playing routine lady roles. She wasn't mature enough to compete with stars like Susan Hayward, Donna Reed, or Gloria Graham for roles in which she might have excelled, nor was she enough of a bombshell to compete with Ava Gardner, Elizabeth Taylor, or Marilyn Monroe. Eventually, after 6 years worth of middling parts, she began to ask herself, what am I doing here? Anne craved something different, more demanding. The stage and New York were calling. Playwright William Gibson, director Arthur Penn, and producer Fred Coe were looking for an actress to cast in their new Broadway play, Two for the Seesaw. Anne absolutely nailed the audition. Gibson later said that it was like his character had walked off the pages into real life. Despite valid concerns about her lack of star power and her experience, she won the role. In his review of the play, critic Walter Kerr wrote that the young actress who seems to have just come to us from television has the range of one of the newer guided missiles. And remember, Anne had been acting in movies for over 5 years by that point, so the fact that he was unclear about her resume hints at how poor her name recognition was. Still, in 1958, she won the Tony for Best Supporting Actress in a Play for her Broadway debut. Penn and Gibson, building on this momentum, then cast Anne in their next play, The Miracle Worker. Based on the real lives of Annie Sullivan and Helen Keller, the play chronicles the early days of their lifelong relationship, as Sullivan begins to teach Helen, who was both blind and deaf, to communicate. Anne conducted considerable research for this role, studying blindness at medical centers, attending conferences for teachers of the blind and deaf, learning sign language, and even taping her eyes shut to experience the world as a blind person. A fun fact, Anne found it difficult to shed the Bronx accent that she used in Two for the Seesaw. She was from the Bronx herself. So they just decided that Sullivan would have an Irish accent to help Anne find the character. She was not Irish. But the work paid off, and once again her reviews for the play were outstanding. She won another Tony, this time for Best Actress. According to Douglas Daniel, the 1-2 punch of these achievements changed everything. The national media reintroduced her to the public and began treating her like a celebrity. Time magazine featured her on the cover of its December 21st, 1959 issue, making her one of a handful of performers each year who drew a major personality profile. But despite this newfound fame, studios were not eager to give Anne a second chance at movie stardom in the film adaptation of The Miracle Worker. United Artists, which financed the film, estimated that a big star like Elizabeth Taylor or Audrey Hepburn would bring in $10 million or $7 million respectively at the box office, while Anne Bancroft would only bring in about $2 million. Penn and Gibson resisted. They believed that big stars would transform their character-driven drama into melodrama, and thought Anne's interpretation of their work deserved to be committed to film. They'd lost the rights of Two for the Seesaw and ended up hating the eventual film adaptation, so they fought to retain the rights of The Miracle Worker in order to specifically veto corporate choices like this. The studio reluctantly agreed to Anne, then promptly slashed the budget from $2 million to $500,000. And to the studio's credit, they pretty much hit the target on that one. The Miracle Worker shouldn't be as exciting or suspenseful as it is. The audience probably already knows what happens to Annie Sullivan and Helen Keller in real life. But the chemistry and concentration Anne Bancroft and Patty Duke display in these roles elevate the film to a heart-wrenching, performance-driven nail-biter. It's easy to understand why actresses would clamor to play Sullivan. She's bold, intelligent, vulnerable, and frankly unique in the cinema of any era. A woman with a complex inner life, doing her job, interacting with another woman for a purpose that has almost nothing to do with a man. Just as impressive was the extreme physicality required for this role. If films from this era largely confined women to the domestic sphere, The Miracle Worker is the closest thing to a war movie you're going to get. Sullivan's attempt to get Helen to use a spoon mid-tantrum becomes a thrilling and grueling food fight that literally lasts for 10 minutes. On stage, this scene resulted in real injuries and required layers of padding to protect the actors' bodies. The film required similar precautions, but took 5 days to shoot. It's no wonder that these performances stuck with critics and voters alike. Critic William Hebert wrote, "Miss Bancroft gives such a powerful, tender, and impressive performance that it could rarely be equaled by any other female star with such demands put on her in the character without going overboard." Time magazine called the duo of Anne Bancroft and Patty Duke quite possibly the most moving double performance ever recorded on film. The Oscar nomination soon followed. Joining Anne in the category were Lee Remick in Days of Wine and Roses, Geraldine Page in Sweet Bird of Youth, Katharine Hepburn in Long Day's Journey into Night, and of course, Bette Davis in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. Just like Anne's filmography, we can think about these nominees in two groups. Let's start with the actors. From the late 1940s through the mid-60s, Broadway and Hollywood were strongly connected. Consider that 3 of the 5 roles in this category were for adaptations of plays, or that the majority of actors who won an Oscar and Tony for the same role did so during this period. While Viola Davis's recent double win for Fences looks more like an anomaly than any sustained interest in play-to-film adaptations. Stage actors, playwrights, and directors participated in this exchange, trading ideas and stories that eventually helped both filmmaking and acting evolve on screen. Particularly influential was the Actors Studio, a membership-based organization now famous for refining the Stanislavski technique, otherwise known as method acting. The method has a funny reputation these days. It seems like it's typically invoked by people who want an excuse to misbehave on set, or to make a joke about Daniel Day-Lewis living his everyday life as Abraham Lincoln. The approach differed based on the teacher, but the goal was to teach actors to recall personal emotional memories analogous to what a character feels in the scene, and then let those inner truths guide the actor's actions. And although originally developed for the stage, this internally focused technique was ideally suited for the intimacy of film acting, where close-ups capture the smallest, most nuanced reactions. Until this point, most Hollywood acting was star acting, in which the performer was expected to project the same winning persona from role to role. And by contrast, the method was intended to train actors to lose themselves in roles. So actors like Montgomery Clift, James Dean, and especially Marlon Brando ushered this style from the stage to the screen, shifting the standard for what a prestigious performance should look like. Not everyone used the same method, but I mentioned Stanislavski specifically because this training helped Anne mature into quote-unquote best actress material. She resumed acting lessons upon returning to New York City under Herbert Berghoff, a renowned teacher who went on to teach actors like Al Pacino and Robert De Niro. Then she began studying at the Actors Studio twice a week upon the recommendation of Arthur Penn, who, you guessed it, also belonged there. This intellectual approach, the kind that would encourage taping your eyes shut, fit her really well. It was the antidote to the somewhat vapid, routine acting that she'd been doing in Hollywood. She pursued this education to succeed on the stage, but it inadvertently prepared her to film The Miracle Worker, perhaps more than her years of film acting had. Not only that, but this second life as a serious stage actress gave her an observable, somewhat trendy mold for the press to define her. She wore little makeup, casual clothing, and spoke about what she was reading. As one profile put it, there was a time when the spirit of gay irresponsibility characterized a whole generation of actors. Today, the keynote seems to be brooding intensity. Perhaps the first to publicly display this quality was Marlon Brando, and at any rate, Anne Bancroft is certainly not the last. All three of these actors studied at the Actors Studio, as did other Best Actress winners like Joanne Woodward and Patricia Neal. The list of prestigious graduates goes on and on. And I'm not saying Academy voters based their decision on some secret checklist that tracked who had the right teacher or who practiced the right technique. Rather, that their majority here represents a gradual yet total shift away from the classic Hollywood style of filmmaking. These women met the modern standard of prestige dramatic performance. They were new, young, and of the era. And that's what makes the other two nominees so interesting. By 1962, Bette Davis and Katharine Hepburn were veterans, Oscar winners, legends. But their dual presence in the Best Actress category caused quite a stir. Articles announcing the nominations led with their faces plastered alongside headlines that basically boiled down to, what is this, 1937? Always the outlier, Katharine Hepburn did have a steady stream of good roles and even Oscar nominations throughout the 1950s, unlike most of her peers from the classic era, which we'll talk about more in part 2. But Bette Davis hadn't been nominated since 1953, and neither of them had won since the 1930s. Maybe audiences were used to Katharine being around, but 2 classic heavy hitters, and worse, 2 women over 50 years old. Their nominations triggered powerful nostalgia and, in fact, aligned with a small resurgence of popularity for old Hollywood in general. TV networks in need of programming turned to studios for access to their catalogs. When these older films aired during prime time, it was likely the first time fans got to see them since they were actually in theaters. It was really exciting to remember, let's say, how much you loved Dark Victory, and then go see a brand new Bette Davis movie in theaters. In 1962, Kate was really just getting started. She only had one of her 4 eventual Oscars at this point. But with her nomination for Baby Jane, Betty broke the record for the number of nominations by an actress and had the opportunity to become the first actress to win 3, which she really, really wanted.
I was furious because that would have made me the first person with 3. And as you know, I always have to be first as an Aries.
One problem. There was another 30 star who was very much present in 1962, but not quite as present as she wanted to be in this race. Joan Crawford did not receive a nomination for her reserved, disciplined performance as Blanche, the sister of and foil to Bette Davis's more eccentric Jane. Joan was, of course, disappointed by this snub, and her reaction, depending on who you ask, ranged from petty to unforgivable. Essentially, Joan approached Betty's fellow nominees and offered to accept the Oscar for them were they to win. Here's where things can get a little bit dicey. When it comes to research, there is very little information here that one can actually confirm, and a lot of rumors that are fun to talk about but are uncorroborated. I've checked 4 biographies, read dozens of contemporary newspapers, and many articles about this on the internet, and I cannot for the life of me find any details about how Joan arranged this, just that it was generally arranged, volunteered, or offered. But I think the general sense, or maybe what feud would have you believe, is that Joan manipulated some of the nominees into not attending, or that they basically took pity on her and let her accept the award on their behalf. What's often lost in this conversation is that those nominees were likely already skipping the ceremony anyway. Katharine Hepburn never attended the ceremony when nominated. Both Geraldine Page and Anne Bancroft were again starring on Broadway. Anne in Mother Courage, another very physically taxing role, and Geraldine in Strange Interlude. Both of them would have to miss performances, and in 1963, that wouldn't have seemed necessary. The stage was their primary source of employment and prominence, and the Academy Awards were not the media circus, #Lux crucial industry event that they are today. In addition, neither woman believed she would win. Sure, Geraldine had won the Golden Globe, but in the 1960s, that did not foreshadow an Academy Award. More like the opposite. She apparently told one author that Joan called her, that she was starstruck, delighted, and relieved by Joan's offer because it meant, quote, "I wouldn't have to fly all the way to California or spend a lot of time looking for a new dress to wear." Not to mention that the day before the Oscars, Geraldine participated in a 9-hour recording session of the play as part of an increasing move by companies to produce albums of current plays. One could imagine a similar reaction from Anne, who was quite literally carrying the struggling production of Mother Courage on her back. Basically, if Joan did do any manipulating here, it was not the work of a mastermind bitch on a mission. Not to say that her offers weren't extraordinarily petty, but it was also a pretty simple read of the chessboard. She saw an opportunity, and she took it. Part 2 will dive much deeper into this moment, but one important takeaway that does belong here is that we should not presume Joan's alleged anti-Betty crusade was the most effective element or sole determining factor in this race. That narrative discounts the stylistic and genre preferences we discussed earlier, as well as any work other studios, agents, or actors did for their own benefit, and extensively promoted The Miracle Worker in print and on TV, and even won multiple Critics' Awards prior to the Academy Awards. The press easily framed her story as a triumphant return to movies. How fascinating that Anne Bancroft had been under the studio's noses this whole time, that she had not only proved the film industry wrong, but also completely reinvented herself. She had the kind of determination, talent, and gumption not seen by many actresses who had been considered just another pretty face. Douglas writes, "Wisely, she did not gloat over her comeback in one of the best roles of the year, nor did she badmouth the entire industry or Hollywood culture she held in disdain. She faulted herself, contending that her unhappiness with the pedestrian, forgettable films she made was the result of immaturity and confusion over what mattered to her. We, of course, hate to see any woman blame herself for something that wasn't her fault at all, but this approach, whether intentional or not, demonstrated a humility that voters, aka industry insiders, probably would have liked to hear." On Oscar night, both she and Patty Duke won Oscars for their performances in The Miracle Worker. Anne watched at home in New York, crying and laughing at the unexpected but very welcome and hard-earned award as Joan approached the podium to accept for her. A few days later, Joan attended a performance of Mother Courage and, obviously with press in tow, presented the award to the elated and still fully costumed Anne at the end of the show. As I said at the beginning of this video, we often talk more about who lost this year than who won. By doing so, we lose this wonderful moment in Anne Bancroft's career. Author Stephen Tapert points out that despite her new Academy Award-winning credentials lifting her to the pantheon of acting royalty, Bancroft's intelligence and fierce independence ensured that she would never conform to movie stardom again. In the kind of ultimate move of badassery, she became an actress who pretty much did what she wanted to do. More gritty dramas like The Pumpkin Eater, but also comedic collaborations with husband Mel Brooks like To Be or Not to Be. She became one of only a handful of women in her peer group to write and direct her own movie, and received 4 more Oscar nominations, including, famously, for The Graduate, and one of my personal favorites, The Turning Point in 1978. It's worth spending time on this winner, whether you liked this win or not. I can think of at least one person who didn't, but she'll have to wait for part 2.